Hello, everybody. Hello, John. Thank you, Joe. Just that. I'm so delighted we have a local panel. I'm actually a local boy, and I know the Bronx River really well. I know the harbor and Lower Hudson really well. What's that? Hudson River Estuary Program. And the Estuary, of course. Wow. Yeah, and the Hudson River Estuary Program, which I actually wrote the legislation for. So thanks for reminding me. And I grew up in Yonkers, just down the road here, and I was just saying to Michelle that when I grew up in Yonkers, we thought the whole purpose of the Hudson River was to separate New York from New Jersey, and that was the extent of our local knowledge about the river. But it actually does more than that, Peter. Yeah. I also, for those of you who are old enough, I also thought that the beautiful Palisades that we could see across the river were named for the amusement park that sat on top of them. But you have to be old enough to understand what that actually means, and Peter is. So thank you for you all gathering. I want to introduce the moderator of our panel, my good friend and colleague, Michael Finewood, who's assistant professor of environmental studies and science at Pace, and part of the crew in the Dyson College Institute for Sustainability and the Environment. Michael is a human geographer and political ecologist with research and teaching interests in environmental governance, water, and urban sustainability, with explicit attention to critical geographics and justice. During his career, Finewood's research is focused on how communities perceive and make decisions about water infrastructure with the goal of improving equitable outcomes. His current work centers on green infrastructure, urban stormwater governance, and suburban stormwater management. Mike is an assistant professor in our Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences. We're delighted that he's part of our Dyson team, and he was a critical member of our organizing committee for the conference. So take it away, Mike.
And thanks, everybody, for sticking it out. I know it's been a long day, but hopefully we can try to tie some of these pieces together. Can everybody hear me okay with the microphone? How's that? Better? Could be better or just better? How's that? All right. Joe, just let me know if I'm messing up. All right. So I've been sort of reflecting a bit on the conversation so far today, just to think about how it ties into our panel. And there were two big themes that have really come out, I think, from our conversation. One is the big picture. We've talked a lot about the big picture, both in terms of time and scale. I think we could look to Peter's talk to think a little bit about that. And the second one was really a lot about how technology, innovation, and policy will lead to social and environmental goods. And I think we can look back to Berkowitz and Friedman's talks to think a little bit about that. And in fact, reflecting back way a while ago to our first panel, who made the point that at the local scale, there often seems to be something missing about this big picture, thinking that they focus very much on local issues and not situate themselves, say, in broader watersheds, as well as pointing out often that at these local scales, they're sort of cash-strapped and really don't have the access to the technology that's available. But what I'd like to do for our panel is kind of flip that statement on its head and ask, how does the big picture lose perspective on the local complexity and the local challenges, which is really where the rubber is hitting the road? So in other words, what we're going to do here is just ask what's going on at that local scale. What are we doing as we're addressing these big picture questions? So our panel today is deliberately made up of folks who work at the local level. Not to say they don't engage with these other scales, but are very invested in working in local communities to try to solve very pressing problems. And I think if we reflect back to the panel just before ours, there was this question of how do we get people to care? This is the group of people who are really thinking about how we get people to care. So just real quick, and of course you can read the bios, and they're also right behind us. We have Emily Vail on the end, who's from the Hudson River Estuary Program. Pete Malinowski from the Billion Oyster Project. I tried to merge those together. And Michelle Luebke from the Bronx River Alliance. And I do have the website open where you can pose questions. I know we may have lost a little bit of that. I think they might put it back up, but it's pace.edu/watercues. So if you'd like to pose a question that I can try and squeeze in as we're going. So what I thought would be really useful as we're sort of starting off thinking about our local community, I thought it'd be worthwhile for you to talk about the communities that you work in or work with, so we could have a sense of, you know, who are these people, what types of environments are you working in, and that can help frame, I think, some of the other issues. Michelle, why don't you get us started?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for still being here. As our organization title makes obvious, we work within the Bronx River watershed. And as was alluded to in the previous panel, water doesn't pay attention to political boundaries. And so we actually have two major divides. We have Westchester County, which is the upper 2/3 of our river. For those of you who don't know, the Bronx River is the only freshwater river in New York City. There are other creeks, but we're the only river. And so it's a 24-mile body of water, and it encompasses everything from affluence down to the poorest congressional district in the country, and that's the South Bronx. So everything that happens upstream ends up down in the South Bronx. So we have a lot of issues, but we try to bridge those gaps. We try to work with all the different municipalities, and we try to move forward engaging local communities in these conversations so that it's not just water quality issues, but it's also, and water quantity, but it's also access. Sometimes this is the green spaces that we've created in this corridor along the river, sometimes those are the only green spaces in these highly urbanized contexts. So, and then also that comes with the access issue is the health implications. So Dan had mentioned visible pollution. And if the Cuyahoga River's on fire, it's obvious that you're not going to go swimming in it. But when the Bronx River looks clean because you can't see the fecal contamination, then on a hot summer's day, that may be the only swimming hole. And it is not fishable or swimmable. And in fact, we have avid recreation programs and encourage people to try not to splash, you know. And so you end up having this really fundamental question of how do you build community engagement with this vital natural resource and encourage them to explore it and use it as a learning environment and a laboratory and a community advocacy tool, and yet we knowingly know that it's a contaminated resource and that touching the water during these experiments could actually result in them having health issues. And so that's one of the concerns that we have as a community organization.
Sure. Our community is pretty much, we work primarily with schools to do our outreach, so our community is focused on schools, and that's schools in all 5 boroughs. We focus our outreach on low-income communities, but our goal is to create a narrative and an incentive to get kids down on the water's edge, experimenting with oysters and learning about the factors that play into whether or not they can survive and reproduce in various places in the harbor. So we work with about 90 middle and high schools throughout the city and provide them with oyster cages with experiments attached to them and a curriculum to go along with it. And so the goal there is to make learning about New York Harbor and oysters and oyster restoration a reality for as many of the 1.1 million public school students as possible. And then we do have a number of other programs where we work sort of with in community groups in various areas, but the primary outreach, our primary community, I think, is the public school students throughout the city. Yeah.
So I work for the Hudson River Estuary Program, which is a non-regulatory program of the State Department of Environmental Conservation. So our program area actually stretches from the federal dam at Troy all the way down to New York City. And I work with community-based watershed groups and municipalities in that whole region. So it's about 10 counties. We consider it the Hudson River Estuary Watershed. And so some of the groups that I work with range from neighborhood groups or community-based citizen groups to more structured intermunicipal councils where municipalities have signed intermunicipal agreements where they're focused on one particular stream or river to work on. The groups are doing all kinds of different activities, from collecting water quality information or habitat information, consolidating that information, and using that to make some strategic decisions about what sorts of projects to implement and how to move forward to protect clean water in their communities. So I'm involved in a number of different specific local initiatives, but also work broadly across the region to make sure that people are sharing information and success stories, and also some of the challenges so that we're not reinventing the wheel.
Thanks. So throughout the day, we've heard a lot, I think, policy prescriptions, technology ideas, things that, obviously coming from different scales and perspectives that, we see solving many of the problems that we're coping with. And I think one thing that just keeps popping in my mind is how, congruent or not is that with the concerns of some of these communities that you're working with. So let me phrase that question in this context. What concerns do rise to the top of these communities? Is it water quality, quantity? Does it come into some other type of conversation that we haven't even covered today? And I think this could go really, Pete, take us away.
Thanks. That's an interesting question. I think it plays into a lot of the topics of the day in these grand technological solutions, or these sort of top-down solutions to the problem, and how you can, and when it comes down to it, the problem with our local communities that we work with, their water issues are non-existent before we bring these issues up, right? Because if you tell New Yorkers that they're running out of water, they'll say, no, I'm not, because I have plenty of water. Or the water's too contaminated, they'll say, where's the water that's so contaminated? Most New Yorkers we work with on a regular basis don't identify as living on the water, or being a harbor community, or having having water be any part of their daily life, right? And so a big part of our work is to build an affinity and a relationship with the water. And every environmentalist that I've ever met, or everyone who identifies as an advocate for the environment, typically has some sort of formative experience that they had that connected them to an environment near where they grew up, or where they summered, or where they, some experience where they fell in love with the natural world. And that was true for me, and it's not true for a lot of kids growing up in New York City. And so a big part of our challenge, the first challenge, is to get people excited about the harbor and understand that there is life in the harbor, and it's interesting. And even today, right, we talk about how polluted it is, but you can pull up a cage of oysters and find seahorses and pipefish and anemones and all these cool animals that most people don't think exist still in the harbor, but they're still there. And so providing that connection, we think is really important to creating those bigger solutions and advocating for the larger change. Because if any of you have ever been to a long-term control plan meeting, there'll be about 6 other people in the room, and the New York City Department of Environmental Protection will be using their opinion as public opinion. So if you get 6 more people in the room, that's not a big shift, but it can fundamentally change the experience that New York City DEP has with the public, because that's like a primary tool that they have for understanding what public intent is, or where to set tolerances for combined sewage overflows and things like that. I don't know that.
Yeah, that's great.
So I work with a really diverse group of communities, ranging from more rural streams all the way down to cities like Yonkers and Poughkeepsie and Kingston and others. I think one of the big drivers, one of the big concerns, is that people want to be able to enjoy their streams. And that is often recreation, whether it's kayaking or having kids splash in the local neighborhood stream and being able to do so safely. So we see a lot of people really concerned about sewage contamination, and if they're going to get sick from touching their water or interacting with it. one of the big issues that happened last year, it was a major harmful algal bloom in the Wallkill River in particular. We're seeing a lot of harmful algal blooms in ponds and lakes, but this was one of the first examples of a really large river system that had about 50 miles of a harmful algal bloom that turned the river bright green, that had confirmed very high levels of toxins. And so there were businesses that couldn't operate their kayaking. It really harmed tourism. I had a conversation with a young couple with an infant who were about to go swimming in it, and they weren't sure if they should or not. And so that's a really major issue, too, that deals with, again, climate change and water temperatures rising, but also nutrient pollution. Some other issues that have been coming up include flooding. Obviously, the hurricanes like Sandy and Irene have a big impact, but also smaller storms. Extreme weather has caused a lot of flooding of small streams that maybe people didn't even know existed before that torrential downpour happened. And another issue that people are concerned about is the connectedness of the stream corridors and looking at fish passage. So where fish may hit the end of the road as they're traveling upstream can be a really important element for habitat. So river herring, eel, other species that are traveling up from the Hudson River into these tributaries. People are concerned not only about the human use of the stream, but also its value for fish and other species that are living in the river.
Okay. So as you are, we're hearing, diversity in knowledge, diversity in community, diverse connections, or diversity in experiences that connect them. I'm really wanting to hear about some of the projects that you're working on, and thinking about not just the projects themselves that you try to address these multiple issues, but what barriers you see existing or challenges, and I think perhaps most importantly at this point, what sort of promising signs do you see coming out of the work that you're doing? Michelle, should I get you first?
Yeah. So one of the promising things is we have been doing water quality monitoring, and we found a troublesome outfall and had brought this to people's attention over and over and over again. And finally, one of the municipalities who, again, strapped for cash. They have failing infrastructure, but they're also bankrupt. So where do you balance the prioritization of scarce funding? But we have been working with them to try to find infrastructure grants and support for them so that they can address some of these issues. And in fact, they went in and did a test and found that this particular outfall in question had a diner and an apartment building connected to it. And so because we brought this to them, they were able to really efficiently use their resources to trace back that pipe and find where the problem could have been, as opposed to them going to the river and doing the diffuse sampling and then finding the outfall. So what we're piloting this year with the help of EPA, Urban Water's small grant funding, which we are thankful was not affected, because EPA is a huge funder of two of our main projects, this one included. So we are piloting a citizen science monitoring program. So we're getting people, they don't have to be scientists, although they could be, to come out and collect the water samples and get involved and get engaged. And we had a training last Saturday, and it was fantastic. We had 37 people there for 4 different watersheds, and it was the outpouring of enthusiasm is great, and we really see citizen science as an excellent vehicle to get people involved. And when they're involved, like Pete said, they're engaged with their resource, they become more active advocates for it, and they become excellent stewards for that resource, and they become the most powerful voice. Because you can get a bunch of environmentalists saying the water should be cleaner, but when you have an outcry of citizens saying the water should be cleaner, people tend to listen to that a little bit more. Sadly, but at least we can then create the public enthusiasm for these changes and hopefully affect something positive.
Would you give your nickel definition of citizen science?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Citizen science is essentially people participating in scientific research. Traditionally, it was sort of like crowdsourcing of data, but I don't like that definition because that makes the people who are participating just sort of data collection monkeys, and that's not what citizen scientists are. Citizen scientists are really really strong advocates for their resource, and then I think really to take citizen science to the level where it needs to be is that's where you get data-driven advocacy that you can then take to make appropriate public policy and also start addressing environmental justice issues. So it's really getting people involved in the scientific process.
Sure. So as far as successes and projects, we've found oysters to be a remarkable tool for building enthusiasm and excitement about the harbor, the Hudson River, and all of the waters we share. But besides being a sort of unremarkable creature, people think oysters are cool, and it really captures public enthusiasm in a big way. And so our projects, we have the sort of small-scale projects at schools around the city, and then about a dozen in-water, what we call restoration research projects, where we're putting large numbers of animals in the water to study their reproductive dynamics or how they filter the water or whether or not they recruit other oysters and what other animals live in these sites. And that builds even more enthusiasm when we get citizen scientists down monitoring that work. But the biggest barrier, our biggest hurdle, the biggest thing standing in our way is the fear that oysters pose a public health risk, that oysters in contaminated waters are a public health risk. It's the same reason you're not allowed to plant trees, because people might climb up the trees and fall out of them. Right? It's a joke. You're allowed to plant trees. But the
Oyster jokes.
oyster joke, right? Oysters are seen as the folks who regulate shellfish in New York State are the biggest, reduce our projects in scale. So the amount of oysters that we have, the funding to restore, the public will to restore, the partners to restore are reduced in scale, and our projects are reduced by that one fear, the fear that New Yorkers won't be able to control themselves and will go down to the water's edge, eat contaminated oysters, and get themselves sick, which I think is pretty ridiculous. And the other fear is that they might end up in a restaurant, which is also a little far-fetched because the oysters we grow, if you saw them, you would not eat them at a restaurant. And restaurants have their own system of keeping tags and getting their oysters from legitimate sources. So this sort of fantasy fear is our biggest hurdle, is getting permission to put the oysters in the water is the hardest thing for us to do.
So I'm going to keep using the Wallkill River as an example for some of the barriers that some of the other watershed groups face. So the Wallkill River is about a 90-mile river system. It flows north from New Jersey into New York State, and it ends up in the Hudson River in the Rondout Creek in Kingston, for those of you unfamiliar with that particular watershed. So it's a big system. It crosses 2 states, several counties, lots of smaller municipalities, cities, villages, and towns. And so this intermunicipal question is a challenge that many of these groups face. But not only that the jurisdictions are different, but also how do you communicate with people who are upstream and downstream? So there's a communication challenge. And how do you bring stakeholders together who have different goals or visions for a particular resource? How do you get them at the table and talk about their values? When the Wallkill River turned bright green for several months, it raised a lot of alarm, and people really paid attention to it. But not everyone knew what to do. It wasn't necessarily clear whose problem this was or how this was going to be solved. And so it took a lot of creative thinking. Who's going to make the signs at the public access points to make sure that infant doesn't go into this toxic water? Who's going to sample the water to see if it really is as toxic as it appears? And so the group was able to have some really great discussions with partners and create more of a partnership so that they could get samples taken and assessed by the DEC to make sure that it was in fact exceeding these toxic levels. They were able to communicate with the town so that people knew what was happening and they could alert their residents. And they were able to find some different mechanisms for bringing people together and where to fit all of these different players into the puzzle, the clean water puzzle. So I think there are some promising signs for figuring out how to work with agencies, counties, other groups, nonprofit communities, businesses, but also some barriers in doing that as well.
Thanks. Maybe keep the microphone over there because you've kind of, in a good way, led into the next question. And I also have one from the audience that I think ties in here nicely as well. And this is first thinking about these diverse stakeholders that you're talking about. I mean, we're talking about not just diverse communities, how people identify themselves, but also municipalities, up watershed, down watershed. The Bronx River, to me, is a very glaring example of this. So what kind of strategies do you use to get those people at the table talking about their values? That can't be an easy task. So Emily, you started to talk about that.
Sure. So that's something that I see a lot of groups do when they're trying to get started. And I think it's something that the groups would do well to revisit as well, which maybe is room for improvement. So having some sort of a kickoff where they cast a really wide net and invite anyone who wants to participate and have some sort of a session where people can say, these are what my values are. So it's less of a, we did some water quality monitoring and here's the results, and more of a conversation with some of these different voices. I think that there's ways that sometimes requires some really delicate facilitation, and there's ways that conversation can be really productive, and there's ways that certain voices can be louder than others, or certain interests can be louder than others. So the Wallkill group is one of them. The Sawkill Creek Watershed Community, the Mechanico River Watershed Alliance. All of these groups have had kickoffs recently where they've invited people to the table and said, what do you value most about your particular water body? And I think collecting that information, writing it down, making sure it's visible is a really important step in understanding where people are coming from, but also figuring out how people can work together and thinking about planning and thinking about how to be as strategic as possible with some of these implementation projects as well.
Yeah, so our solution is pretty standard. Put oysters in the water in various places, right? But when we begin that process, we have a new program which we call our Community Reefs program, where the idea is building an oyster reef in your neighborhood, and we'll go to these places where there already is some type of water access, like the Sebago Canoe Club in Canarsie, or around Kaiser Park and Coney Island, places like that, and we'll bring representatives from sort of our different constituents. So community leaders, community groups, schools, teachers, students, parents, and bring them all down to the water's edge, and oftentimes fishermen in these different places, and ask those questions. If you had an oyster reef here, where would you want it to be? How would you typically access the water? Where's the safest place to access the water? What type of support would you need to be able to get out to this reef on a regular basis? And we've found that by engaging the community and actually asking how they would do something, you end up with a lot more buy-in to begin with. But those are sort of, those meetings are more homogenous than the sort of these river examples which cross through multiple counties. I think they're different, but there's not a lot of each meeting is sort of a homogenous group of people because it's in a specific neighborhood. Sort of interesting.
Something to add to that?
Sure. We have a project called Project Waste, and WASTE is an acronym. It's Water and Street Trash Elimination. And it's our trash program, which is one of our major impairments. And one of the things that we're doing with that is we are collecting information on what is being trapped by these two various trash booms. One of them collecting information on what's coming out of Westchester County, and then one that's collecting information on what's coming out of the Bronx. And what we're hoping to do with that is to create, again, this data-driven model of let's find restoration solutions that are actually addressing what the problem is. And we know what the problem is because we've done the appropriate scientific investigation to discern what the problem is. So this trash model is we're looking at the quantity, the type, the materials, but also the brands of the trash in these two distinct geographic locations, and then comparing them, saying, are we seeing the same type of floatables coming out of Westchester as we're seeing coming out of the Bronx? If so, how do we address them? If not, then we're going to need to find two different strategies. And so then what we do with that is we take that information, and the data then becomes the driver of our education and outreach programs. So we've developed curriculum around the data from the study, and then that allows the outreach to actually address the particular demographic. So what we're trying to do is diversify the groups that are receiving the data to do the outreach and have them create their own outreach that would speak to them. And then by creating enough of these models with different demographics, with different socioeconomic, with different geographic distributions, with different ages, the same messages are not going to resonate with an elementary school student as with a retiree. So what we're trying to do is really let the people drive the message with the data in hand, so that it's accurate and it's representative, and then it's also really addressing the issue using the language and the means and the method to speak to the particular demographic that we're trying to reach.
So I keep thinking about these conversations that many of us have probably been a part of, hearing people's values and what they want for these spaces, and how appealing they are probably to water nerds like us. But I think a question that came in that's pretty relevant here, and I just want to read this as is, and you can interpret it however you want. Do any of the panelists get frustrated in their efforts in that it seems no one is listening and no one seems to know you exist? Should you give up? I had to add that last part. I'm just wondering if I know who might have asked that question, but I think I've been getting the eds first. So Pete, why don't you take us on this one?
Yeah, it's certainly frustrating, but there is an enormous amount of hope in what we're trying to do. I think that, and young people are very hopeful in general. So the fact that we work with about 7,000 middle school students a year, and each one of them, if you have a conversation with them, has a new understanding, a new affinity, and a new sort of a new relationship with the harbor and with the animals that live in it. And they may do something with that, or they may not, but in their conversations around the dinner table, their conversation with their friends, they're talking about this new cool thing that they know about. And that, hearing those conversations and hearing young people talk about how excited they are, wondering how their oysters are doing, or wondering how, another school's oysters are doing, and being directly engaged in it makes you very, very hopeful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think that some of these sort of larger, more well-known solutions may be equally as frustrating. Just thinking about the Big U example, which came up earlier, that sounds like a big, long, frustrating job. Mm-hmm. So I think that sort of frustration part goes both ways, probably.
Emily, how do you not give up?
Well, I get frustrated, like everyone, like every human out there. I think I'm in a unique position where groups come to me, and I want to promote clean water in the Hudson River Estuary Watershed, but it's a really big place, and the way that I prioritize my time and energy is who approaches me and what groups say, we really care about this resource and we need your help. So it's really energizing and inspiring to hear from so many people across the Hudson Valley that they really care about their local streams. I wish I had more time to give them. There's not enough of my time to go around. And I think that's really significant, that there are lots of people who care. And there's certainly more people who could care who don't yet. But that's my job, is to help, just as I'm inspired by them, help them reach out to broader communities and get their message out at the local level as well. So I don't think I should give up. I'm not planning to. And I think that if you were to dip your toe in this world, there's an endless source of inspiration, even when things are really bad or even when things are frustrating. I think there's a lot of value to having these difficult conversations, in addition to doing these types of projects and reaching out. So I don't know if that really answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Never give up.
The end.
Yeah. No. Yeah, exactly. It's inspiring to meet the people who care. It's inspiring that every time I go down to the river to collect water, there's somebody fishing or walking on the greenway or asking a question of what are you doing, or showing up on a Saturday to come and learn about Enterococcus. So there are moments where you just put your head in your hands. Like after the BP oil spill, I remember being just so personally crushed because I felt like one person or a collection of a small group of people made some decisions that created an environmental issue that was bigger than anything that I could ever reverse in my entire career, and including every single person I've ever worked with in their entire careers. And that concept really sort of devastated me, but at the same time I said that just furthers why the work that we do is so important.
If I can just follow up real quick. I think it's abundantly clear from this day that one of the biggest, I would argue the biggest challenge facing our natural environment in all these situations is apathy, is just lack of interest in these issues, right? It's come up again and again on all these different panels. And so, and we've referenced the Cuyahoga River and these other things that launched the environmental movement, which caused a nationwide bipartisan, civil unrest that resulted in political change, right? And that, I think that the people we have running our country now would be no less moved by a very open display like that, coming, a nationwide display and an uproar about the system and what's going on in our natural environment, climate change, et cetera. The reality is that it's not in front of very many people's minds. It's in front of your minds and our minds, but not enough people care about it. So I'm motivated every day because I think that our solution, however small and local it may be, is one of the most critical things we can do to build awareness and excitement and appreciation for the natural environment, so that we are, if we are actually in the fight of our lives for our planet and for our city, then we need as many people on our side as possible. And so getting the education and outreach, or however you want to call it, getting the most people excited about it is a fundamental aspect of this fight that we're all engaged in.
Yeah, of course.
I think if you ask to, you'd be surprised at who does care and who's just waiting to be asked and who didn't realize that there was somebody else who cared too. I've been doing some work on a tiny stream in Kingston, New York. It's buried. It's basically a pipe. I think if you ask someone who wasn't from Kingston what was going on over there, they said, oh, that's a ditch or that's a pipe. There's some water in it sometimes. But I was walking, I was showing my dad my sad urban stream when he came to visit, and he really loved it and ended up showing, when the rest of my family came to visit, he wanted to take them on a tour of this stream. It's a very sad stream. It really is not healthy or pretty at all. And while we were walking, some random person stopped me and said, oh, are you looking at the Tannery Brook? I said, yeah, that's the name of the stream. That's what we're looking at. And he said, oh, I used to fish in that. I used to catch crayfish in that. And it was just a tiny section that was in between two houses before it went underground. And so I don't know how I would find that guy again, but there's lots of other people who have had personal experiences with those streams that don't know that there's something that connects all of us. And I think that can be really, really powerful by just asking people.
So we have 10 minutes left, and there's 2 questions that I want to ask. So let me ask this one and hopefully keep it a little shorter. Do your best. But how do you measure success? We've talked about a lot of different things here. Emily, you want to give it a shot?
We count a lot of beans. Yeah, so in state government, we do a lot of bean counting. So we measure success by how many people came to our trainings and how many watershed plans were written in a particular year. But I think what's really a good marker of success for me personally is when you watch groups or individuals really grow and build their capacity and gain expertise and maybe most significantly gain the confidence to speak out. And then you can really start to watch projects unfold and people grow into these really powerful citizen roles. So it's a long and slow process, but I think the success is when the water quality improves, but the success is also when you have a strong constituency that can speak out on behalf of their local stream as well.
We have direct metrics for our shell collection program, how many shells we collect from restaurants, our reef program, how many oysters we put in the water, acreage of bottom coverage, and then we do more and more, we're trying to become more sophisticated with our, working towards behavioral change. So understanding how a citizen scientist or a community member is affected by, how their choices may be different after coming in and working with us on a Saturday or participating in volunteer day or monitoring oyster growth and survival. And then with the students, we look at sort of pre and post tests, very basic blunt instruments to determine what they know when they come in and what they know when they go out, and seeing if there's an increase in the knowledge about their local environment. And then we track attendance in some of our education programs, and then test scores. So whether or not on the standardized tests that everyone's taking, whether or not we see improvements in our cohorts of students who come through the program.
Yeah, so a lot of the things that we do are very similar, so I'm not going to repeat in interest of time, but I will say one success that I think we're pleased with was in the long-term control plan process. We worked with an outside agency to do community advocacy and basically walked around with postcards telling them about the process. And it was the most successful campaign that group that we had worked with has ever launched. And we had the largest attendance at our long-term control plan meeting. And now the Bronx River is one of the only long-term control plans where they actually took chlorination off the table because the public opinion was so strong against chlorination that DEP listened, and so we consider that a success.
Great. So I'm going to ask a big question here where we've only got 5 minutes, so good luck with this one. But I'm curious, we've talked a bit today about justice, environmental justice. We've really just waved at it. So how do you incorporate environmental justice in the work that you do?
That's a big question. The communities we work with, Title I schools, low-income communities in New York City are often on the front lines of, from an environmental justice standpoint, from air quality concerns, water quality concerns, access to open space. And so providing by building advocates from those communities, I think that's and providing our inquiry-based educational experiences for students from those communities. That's the environmental justice that we consider ourselves to be engaged in.
Michelle, you want to tie us up?
Sure. So the Bronx River might as well be a case study for environmental justice. Our Project Waste, as I mentioned before, between June and November of last year, we pulled out over 54,000 pieces of garbage just from the upper boom. Over 40,000 of those were pieces of styrofoam bigger than a dime. So obviously there is something going on, and we need to address it because at this point we should not be having that quantity of garbage going down our rivers. and then it accumulates in the South Bronx. And so we've done our best as an organization to really create access points and really engage people and get them excited about their resource and out on the river, kayaking and canoeing and exploring and doing science and doing citizen science. And yet we are abusing this resource. And I think until people truly begin to value water at an appropriate rate, I don't think we're going to see a fundamental shift. I think if people were as willing to support water restoration as much as they are willing to pay for bottled water at the grocery store, that's when we're going to start seeing wholesale support of the work that we do. And I just don't think that we're at that point yet. So I think we as water advocates need to raise our voices and be walking PSAs, educate the people. Like Pete said, they just don't know. I mean, I'm on trains all the time saying, did you know that every time it rains more than 1/10 of an inch, New York raw sewage flows into all of the water bodies in New York City, and people are aghast, and like, I'll be talking to a friend, and the entire train car will start listening because people just don't know. So whatever we're doing to communicate, we are screaming into a vacuum. This message needs to permeate the rest of society. There is too much money flowing through New York City to have the amount of raw sewage in our waterways.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to go first. So the Hudson River Estuary Program has a variety of different initiatives other than sort of the watershed planning and management work that I do. We have an education program that reaches a lot of school kids up and down the Hudson River, engages them in citizen science opportunities, helps get the word out. Another interesting initiative that we had over the past few years, we have an access program that helps promote building boat launches and docks and other ways for people to get close to the Hudson River so that they have a more personal relationship, so they can enjoy and recreate on the river. And we've been working hard to make our access sites more accessible to people in wheelchairs and with other physical disabilities. So that's one justice implication that I think is really important, making sure that people with all kinds of different backgrounds can still see and fish and enjoy the river. I think that we need to do better on environmental justice. I think that particularly with the watershed groups, there are a lot of barriers to diverse participation for all kinds of different reasons, whether the meetings are held during the day when people who have other jobs can't participate, whether it's when people attend the meetings that their voices aren't heard. And I think that there's we really need to hear from, as we were talking earlier, these more diverse constituents and make sure that all of these stories are represented and that as many people as possible are at the table in a really meaningful way.
Thanks, everybody. These folks really are the ones who are on the front line, so I encourage you to thank them, but also reach out to them and see how you can participate in their work. So thanks, everybody.